Take your things. I don't want any of your junk cluttering up the place anymore, my husband sneered, laughing as he kicked me out and watched me pack my dusty $5 flea market painting. He had no idea he had just thrown away a $12 million masterpiece and legally signed away his rights to every single penny.
Have you ever been made to feel like you and everything you care about are completely worthless to the person you love most? Share your story with me in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel to hear how my darkest day became my ultimate vindication. But long before the gavel dropped and the millions changed my life forever, there was just the crushing reality of an ending I never saw coming. The words hung in the air of our pristine, minimalist living room, heavy and suffocating. The words hung in the air of our pristine, minimalist living room, heavy and suffocating. "I want you out by the end of the week, Clara," Mart said, not even turning away from the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. He didn't look at me. He hadn't really looked at me in years. I sat on the edge of the imported Italian leather sofa, a sofa he had picked out, a sofa I was never allowed to eat on or curl up comfortably upon. My hands trembled as I clutched the throw pillow to my chest. "Just like that?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of 5 years of marriage dissolving into nothing. "Just like that," he replied, his tone as cold and sterile as the stainless steel appliances in the kitchen I was no longer welcome to use. "We both know this hasn't been working. I've already spoken to my lawyer. He'll draw up the papers." He finally turned, his eyes sweeping over me with a dismissive exhaustion that shattered whatever fragments of my heart remained. "Take your things." "Just your things. I don't want any of your junk cluttering up the place anymore." The cruelty in his voice wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet, calculated, and utterly indifferent. That was what hurt the most. There was no fiery argument, no passionate pleading, just a sterile eviction notice from the man I had promised to love for better or worse. I nodded slowly, the tears I refused to let fall burning the backs of my eyes. I was losing my home, my husband, and the life I had built, reduced in a matter of seconds to nothing more than a tenant whose lease had expired. The next 3 days were a blur of brown cardboard, packing tape, and quiet devastation. The apartment felt like a museum, and I was the careless tourist being ushered out before closing time. Mark made a point of being present, hovering in the doorway of the guest bedroom, which had quietly become my bedroom over the last 6 months, watching with a hawk-like intensity. He wanted to make absolutely sure I didn't take anything he deemed valuable. "Make sure you leave the crystal vases," he instructed one evening, sipping a glass of expensive scotch. "They were a gift from my mother." I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to fight over glass. I packed my worn sweaters, my dog-eared paperback novels, and the mismatched coffee mugs I had brought into the marriage. Each item felt like a tiny, pathetic testament to my existence in this sprawling, lifeless penthouse. I folded my clothes meticulously, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity as my life was dismantled. My hand shook as I packed my grandmother's quilt, the one piece of genuine warmth I owned. Every tear of the packing tape sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I felt incredibly small, practically invisible. The worst part wasn't leaving the luxury. It was the realization that I had spent half a decade trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. I had shrunk myself to fit his aesthetic, silenced my laughter to match his quiet elegance, and hidden my vibrant personality to become a suitable accessory. And now, the accessory was being discarded. I sealed another box, the harsh scraping sound echoing the rawness in my chest. I was leaving with nothing but my junk, just as he had demanded. It was on the final day of packing that I reached the back of the closet, my fingers brushing against a dust-covered canvas leaning against the wall. I pulled it out,
coughing softly as a cloud of gray motes danced in the muted closet light. It was an old painting I had found 3 years ago at a roadside flea market during a rare weekend trip to the country. I had bought it for $5, simply because the vivid, swirling colors of the abstract landscape reminded me of a sunset I had seen as a child. Mark had hated it the moment I brought it through the door. I carried the canvas into the living room to wrap it in bubble wrap. Mark walked in, pausing to sneer at the frame. "You're seriously taking that hideous thing?" he asked, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It's literally gathering dust." "It's mine," I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the canvas. "I like it." He let out a dry, mocking laugh that made my shoulders tense. "Of course you do. It's practically the definition of junk. Fits perfectly with the rest of your aesthetic. Just make sure you don't scratch the hardwood floors dragging your trash out of here." His words were meant to sting, to remind me of the vast canyon between his perceived sophistication and my supposedly cheap tastes. But as I traced the thick, textured oil paint with my thumb, I felt a strange sense of comfort. This painting was entirely mine. It held no memories of his judgment, no echoes of our failing marriage. It was a remnant of a day when I felt happy and free. I carefully wrapped it, taping it securely. It was junk to him, but it was coming with me. The morning I left, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray, perfectly reflecting the hollow ache in my chest. I stood by the front door, surrounded by 5 cardboard boxes and a haphazardly wrapped painting. That was it. 5 years of a shared life, condensed into an easily transportable pile of insignificance. Mark emerged from the master suite, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, looking every inch the successful executive who had everything under control. He checked his watch, impatient. "The movers taking the rest of my new furniture are arriving at noon," he stated, a clear dismissal. "Do you have everything?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I looked around the pristine living room one last time. There was absolutely no trace of me left in the space. It was as if I had been thoroughly erased, scrubbed clean from the walls and floors. I picked up the first 2 boxes, my muscles straining under the awkward weight. I walked them out to the elevator, then returned for the rest. On my final trip, I picked up the bubble-wrapped painting and my single suitcase. Mark stood by the kitchen island, already scrolling through emails on his phone. "Goodbye, Mark," I said. The words tasted like ash. He didn't look up. "Leave your key on the console. Close the door tight behind you." A fresh wave of tears pricked my eyes, but I swallowed them down. I placed the silver key on the glass table. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The final click of the deadbolt echoing in the corridor was the loudest, most definitive sound I had ever heard. I was completely, utterly alone. My new reality was a tiny third-floor walk-up studio apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better days. It smelled faintly of bleach, old carpet, and somebody else's fried food. I dropped the last box onto the faded linoleum floor and collapsed onto the cheap, lumpy mattress that the landlord had provided. The silence here was different from the silence in Mark's penthouse. His silence was cold, deliberate, and suffocating. This silence was loud, echoing with the raw, terrifying reality of my new independence. I pulled my knees to my chest, finally allowing the tears I had been holding back for a week to break free. I sobbed until my ribs ached, mourning the illusion of the life I thought I had, the family I thought we were building. I felt like a massive failure, discarded like a broken toy. When the tears finally stopped, leaving me exhausted and hollow, I looked around the dimly lit room. My eyes landed on the bubble-wrapped canvas leaning against the peeling wallpaper. Slowly, I pushed myself off the bed and walked over to it. I tore away the tape and bubble wrap, revealing the vibrant, swirling colors of the flea market painting. In this dreary, cramped space, the colors seemed to explode with life. It was the only beautiful thing in the room. I found a rusty nail already protruding from the wall above a tiny radiator and carefully hung the canvas. I stepped back, wrapping my arms around myself. It was dusty, the frame was slightly chipped, and my ex-husband had mocked it relentlessly. But right now, looking at the warm hues cutting through the gloom of my new apartment, I felt the tiniest, most fragile spark of hope. It was a start. 6 weeks passed, marked by the slow, painful process of untangling our lives on paper. I sat in the polished conference room of Mark's high-priced attorney, feeling entirely out of place in my modest thrift store blouse. Mark sat across from me, radiating impatience, checking his designer watch every few minutes.
My own lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed public assistance attorney named Sarah, sat beside me, reviewing the final separation agreement. As discussed, Mark's lawyer droned, his voice devoid of any human empathy. My client is retaining the penthouse, the investment portfolios, and all marital assets acquired through his primary income. In exchange, he has agreed to a lump sum settlement of $20,000 to assist your client in transitioning. $20,000, a fraction of his yearly bonus. But I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it to be over. And personal belongings? Sarah asked, adjusting her glasses. Section 4, paragraph B, Mark's lawyer pointed to the document. My client specifically waives all rights, claims, and interests in any personal effects, belongings, junk, or items currently in your client's possession. He wants a clean break. What she took with her is entirely hers. He permanently forfeits any future claim to those items. Mark scoffed softly. Trust me, I don't want any of her thrift store trash. She can keep her cheap clothes and her flea market paintings. Just sign the waiver so I can get back to the office. His cruelty was so casual it made my stomach churn. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I looked at Mark, hoping for a flicker of regret or even simple human kindness. There was nothing. With a steady hand, I signed my name, legally securing my absolute right to my junk and unknowingly setting the stage for a miracle. Back in my tiny apartment, the reality of my newly finalized divorce settled over me like a heavy blanket. The $20,000 was a temporary lifeline, but it wouldn't last forever. I needed a job, and I needed it quickly. To distract myself from the looming anxiety, I decided to deep clean the studio. I started with the few belongings I had brought with me. When I reached the flea market painting hanging above the radiator, I noticed just how thick the grime on the canvas truly was. Decades of dust, perhaps even smoke, had dulled the vibrant colors I loved so much. I gently lifted it off the rusty nail and laid it flat on my small kitchen table. Using a soft, damp microfiber cloth, I began to delicately wipe the surface. I was terrified of ruining the cheap paint, but as I wiped away the gray film, something astonishing happened. The colors underneath weren't just bright, they were incredibly complex. The texture of the brushstrokes was masterful, capturing light and shadow in a way that suddenly made the piece feel alive. As I carefully cleaned the bottom right corner, my cloth snagged on a thick ridge of dried oil. I leaned in closer, squinting in the dim overhead light. There, partially obscured by age and a layer of stubborn varnish, were initials, a very distinct, elegant signature, V.V. My heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. I wasn't an art expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I knew enough to realize that this wasn't an amateur's work. The way the paint was layered, the deliberate chaos of the abstract sunset, it felt important. I grabbed my cheap smartphone, my fingers trembling slightly, and typed the initials and a description into the search bar. The internet search yielded overwhelming and terrifying results. The initials VV matched a legendary mid-century abstract expressionist whose works were thought to be mostly accounted for in private collections or prestigious museums. It was impossible. It was a $5 piece of junk from a roadside tent. Yet, staring at the screen and then back at the canvas, a wild, irrational spark of curiosity took hold of me. The next morning, I carefully wrapped the painting in 3 layers of bubble wrap and placed it in a heavy-duty trash bag to protect it from the rain. I took 2 buses across town to a reputable fine art appraisal and auction house I had found online. The receptionist looked at me with polite skepticism as I carried my plastic-wrapped bundle into the immaculate, marble-floored lobby. I felt the familiar sting of class anxiety, the same feeling Mark used to instill in me. "I'd like someone to look at this," I said, my voice barely audible. A senior appraiser, an older man named Mr. Harrison with kind eyes and wire-rimmed glasses, agreed to give me 5 minutes. We went into a private viewing room. As I unwrapped the canvas, I apologized for its dusty condition, but Mr. Harrison didn't speak. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his pocket and leaned so close his nose almost touched the canvas. The silence in the room stretched for an eternity. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounded like a sledgehammer. Finally, he stepped back, removing his glasses, his hands visibly shaking. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice completely devoid of its former professional detachment. "Where on earth did you acquire this? This is a lost masterpiece. We need to authenticate it immediately, but I am nearly certain of what I am looking at." The following 3 weeks were an agonizing limbo. The auction house had taken possession of my painting, placing it in a secure vault while their team of experts, including art historians and chemical analysts, conducted a rigorous authentication process. They paid for a secure transport, treating my $5 flea market find like a holy relic. I went back to my dreary studio apartment, struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. I applied for administrative jobs during the day, trying to maintain a grip on reality, but my mind constantly drifted back to Mr. Harrison's trembling hands. What if it was a sophisticated forgery? What if I was getting my hopes up only to be crushed again? The anxiety gnawed at my insides, but I kept the secret entirely to myself. I certainly couldn't tell Mark. We were in the mandatory waiting period before the judge officially signed the final divorce decree. The paperwork was submitted, the asset waiver was signed, but the gavel hadn't banged yet. If Mark found out there was even a chance I possessed something valuable, he would undoubtedly find a loophole to drag me back into a legal nightmare. He had signed away his rights to my junk, but a masterpiece was an entirely different battlefield. I paced the floorboards of my cramped apartment night after night, the silence no longer echoing with sorrow, but with a frantic, pulsing anticipation. I ate cheap ramen noodles while waiting for a phone call that could potentially rewrite the entire trajectory of my life. I was a discarded wife, cast aside as worthless clutter, secretly sitting on the edge of an unimaginable fortune. I just needed the judge to sign those papers before the auction house finalized their verdict. The day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was cold, smelling of polished wood and stale bureaucracy. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, looking bored, tapping his expensive leather loafers against the floor. He didn't even glance in my direction when I walked in and took my seat next to Sarah, my public defender. This was merely a formality. The judge, an older woman with a stern face, flipped through our thick file of separation agreements. "Both parties have agreed to the division of assets as presented?" the judge asked, her voice projecting through the quiet room. "Yes, Your Honor," Mark's attorney stated firmly. "My client is retaining the primary estate and all financial portfolios." He has waived any and all rights to the defendant's personal property and effects, presently in her possession, in perpetuity. The judge looked over her reading glasses at me. "Do you understand these terms, Clara? You are walking away with the cash settlement and only the personal belongings you currently possess. Your ex-husband will have no future claim to them, and you will have no claim to his estate." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. The judge nodded, picking up her heavy wooden gavel. "Then, by the power vested in me, I declare this marriage dissolved. The asset division is legally binding and irreversible." Bang. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. It was over. I was free. Mark immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a satisfied smirk, finally rid of his clutter. As I stepped out of the heavy courtroom doors into the bright hallway, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my cheap purse. The caller ID flashed, Harrison Fine Arts.
The hallway of the courthouse was bustling with lawyers and distressed couples, but as I answered my cheap, cracked smartphone, the world around me faded into a muffled silence. I pressed the receiver to my ear, my hand trembling so violently I almost dropped the device. "Hello?" I answered, my voice a raspy whisper. "Clara?" came the warm, breathless voice of Mr. Harrison, the senior appraiser. "I hope I am not interrupting anything important. I've been trying to reach you all morning." "My divorce was just finalized," I said, leaning against the cool marble wall to steady my shaking knees. "It's done." "Well, my dear," Mr. Harrison paused, the emotion thick in his throat. "I believe your new life is about to begin. The authentication process is complete." The chemical analysis of the pigments, the canvas age, and the stylistic experts have all reached a unanimous consensus. I closed my eyes, terrified to breathe. And it is an original, undocumented VV, Clara, a lost masterpiece from his peak period. It is without a doubt one of the most significant art discoveries of the decade. We are conservatively setting the starting auction estimate at $12 million. $12 million. The numbers didn't make sense. They sounded like a foreign language. I slid down the marble wall until I was sitting on the floor, clutching my purse to my chest. The tears I had shed for a broken marriage, for a man who treated me like an inconvenience, were suddenly replaced by hot, heavy tears of absolute shock. I looked down at my scuffed thrift store shoes. I wasn't discarded clutter. I was the sole owner of a $12 million masterpiece. Returning to my dingy third-floor studio felt entirely surreal. The smell of bleach and old carpet was exactly the same, but the energy in the room had shifted on its axis. I walked over to the peeling wallpaper above the radiator, staring at the empty, rusty nail where the painting had hung just weeks prior. I sat on the lumpy mattress, wrapping my arms around my knees, letting the silence wash over me. I was a millionaire. The thought was so absurd it almost made me laugh out loud, a sound that hadn't escaped my lips in months. But beneath the initial shock, a profound sense of vindication began to bloom in my chest. Mark had mocked that painting. He had called it hideous, dragging his cruelty over something that brought me a simple, quiet joy. He had insisted I take my trash and leave, stripping me of my dignity because he believed I had no intrinsic value. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, by his obsession with sterile perfection and status symbols, that he had literally kicked a fortune out of his front door. I didn't want the money for luxury cars or penthouses. I had lived in a penthouse and felt like a prisoner. I wanted the money because it meant absolute, untouchable freedom. It meant I would never again have to shrink myself to fit into someone else's life. I laid back on the cheap bed, looking up at the water-stained ceiling. For the first time in 5 years, I felt entirely safe. The next morning, I returned to Harrison Fine Arts. This time, I wasn't a nervous woman clutching a garbage bag in the lobby. Mr. Harrison personally escorted me to a lavish, private boardroom on the top floor. He poured me a cup of rich, dark coffee that tasted infinitely better than the instant powder I had been drinking. "The board is ecstatic, Clara," he said, laying out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. "We want to feature your piece as the crown jewel of our upcoming Autumn Masters auction. It will draw collectors from around the globe." I looked at the paperwork.
And my identity? I don't want a circus, Mr. Harrison. I just want a quiet life. Completely anonymous, he assured me, tapping the contract. You will be listed only as a private collector. The story of the painting's discovery will be publicized. The art world loves a romantic tale of a lost treasure found in obscurity, but your name, your face, and your background will remain strictly confidential. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen he offered me. It felt different than the brass pen I had used to sign my divorce papers just 24 hours ago. That pen had severed my past. This one was building my future. I signed my name on the dotted lines, agreeing to the consignment and the auction house's commission. I was legally binding myself to a new destiny. I handed the pen back, a quiet, genuine smile touching my lips.
Let's show the world what they missed, I whispered.
It took less than a week for the story to break. The auction house released a carefully crafted press statement, and the art world erupted. I sat at my small kitchen table, scrolling through the news on my phone as the headlines multiplied across every major outlet. Lost $12 million masterpiece discovered at country flea market. From $5 junk to multi-million-dollar treasure, the art find of the century. The articles describe the painting's vibrant, swirling sunset colors and the thick, textured oil strokes. They detailed the agonizing decades it spent gathering dust, completely unrecognized by the world, until a sharp-eyed, anonymous collector rescued it from obscurity. I read that phrase over and over. Rescued it from obscurity. It felt incredibly poetic. I hadn't just rescued the painting had rescued me. My phone vibrated with a text from Sarah, my public assistant's divorce lawyer. She had sent a link to one of the articles with a single message. Isn't this the exact painter you asked me about looking up weeks ago? Please tell me this is you. I smiled, typing back a simple, I promised you a nice dinner to thank you for your help. I think I can afford a very good place now. The joy of sharing the secret with the one person who had been kind to me during the darkest weeks of my life was intoxicating. But as I watched the news coverage spread across social media, a cold, sharp dread began to pool in my stomach. The story was everywhere. It was only a matter of time before Mark connected the dots. 3 days after the press release, a loud, aggressive pounding on my apartment door startled me so badly I dropped my coffee mug in the sink. It didn't sound like the usual soft knock of my elderly neighbor. I walked slowly to the door, peering through the scratched peephole. My blood ran cold. It was Mark. He was wearing his signature tailored suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, and his face was flushed with a frantic, uncharacteristic desperation. I took a deep breath, steeling my spine. I was no longer the frightened wife crying over cardboard boxes. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just a few inches, keeping the security chain engaged. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice calm and completely flat. He peered through the crack, his eyes darting around my modest apartment before fixing on me. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Clara? Hi. I know we've had our differences, but I needed to see you. Can I come in?" "No," I replied immediately. "We have nothing to talk about. The paperwork is finalized." His fake smile vanished, replaced by the familiar, condescending sneer. "Don't play games with me, Clara. I saw the news. A $5 painting from a rural flea market? A swirling sunset? I know it's you. I know you have the painting." "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied smoothly, maintaining eye contact. "Stop lying," he snapped, his voice echoing in the drab hallway. "That painting was in my apartment. It's a marital asset, Clara. You stole a $12 million asset from my home. I am legally entitled to half of that money, and you know it." I looked at the man I had once loved, the man who had effortlessly crushed my self-esteem for 5 years, and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no intimidation, just a profound sense of pity for his transparent greed. "You're mistaken, Mark," I said, my tone eerily steady. "You explicitly told me to take my junk. You laughed at me while I packed it. I didn't know it was worth millions."
He yelled, gripping the doorframe. "You deceived me. You hid its value to defraud me in the divorce settlement. My lawyers will tear you apart in court. We will freeze the auction. I will take everything from you." I let his empty threats wash over me, remembering the coldness of the courtroom and the finality of the judge's gavel.
"You didn't want any of my trash cluttering your pristine life," I reminded him softly. "You dragged me to your expensive lawyer to make absolutely certain I couldn't claim a single dime of your bonuses, your investments, or your penthouse. And to protect yourself, you signed an irreversible waiver, forfeiting any future claim to the personal belongings in my possession." His face paled slightly as my words hit their mark, but his anger quickly masked his panic. "A judge will overturn it. It was deception." "It wasn't deception, Mark. It was luck, and it was mine." I reached forward and grabbed the edge of the door. "You evicted me. You threw me out like garbage, and now you have no power over me. Never contact me again."
I slammed the door shut, sliding the deadbolt into place with a satisfying metallic click. He pounded on the wood for another 10 minutes, shouting threats, but I just walked back to my kitchen, feeling lighter than air.
The frantic emails and voicemails from Mark started the next morning. He threatened injunctions, lawsuits, and criminal fraud charges. Despite my outward confidence at the door, a tiny seed of anxiety made me call Sarah, my former public defender. I explained the entire situation, my voice trembling slightly as I recounted Mark's threats. Sarah listened in silence. When I finished, instead of offering legal jargon, she let out a loud, genuine laugh. "Clara, breathe," Sarah chuckled warmly. "Let him waste his money paying his high-priced sharks to look for a loophole. There isn't one." "Are you sure? He said I defrauded him." "You didn't know the value of the painting when you signed the papers, correct?" she asked. I had no idea. The auction house didn't call me until literally 10 minutes after the judge banged the gavel. "Then there is no fraud," Sarah stated confidently. Furthermore, Mark's lawyer drafted that asset waiver himself. He was so arrogant, so eager to protect his own wealth, that he used the broadest, most ironclad language possible to ensure he never had to deal with your belongings again. He legally defined the painting as your sole, separate property before the divorce was even finalized. The gavel bang sealed it. It is untouchable. Relief washed over me like a warm summer rain. Mark had engineered his own downfall. His desperation to strip me of any value had inadvertently protected my greatest asset. He had locked himself out of the vault. I thanked Sarah profusely, hung up the phone, and proceeded to block Mark's number and email address. The silence that followed was beautiful. A week before the auction, I received a thick, formal envelope forwarded to my new P.O. box. It was from Mark's law firm. I opened it carefully, expecting a terrifying summons or a cease and desist order. Instead, it was a beautifully worded, highly professional letter, essentially begging for a settlement. They proposed a quiet, amicable resolution to avoid public embarrassment, offering to drop all pending legal inquiries if I agreed to a 30% cut of the auction proceeds. Reading between the lines of the legal jargon, it was a white flag. They had looked at the contract they drafted, realized they had completely screwed their client, and were now trying to extort me out of sheer desperation. I didn't even dignify it with a response. I ran the heavy, expensive paper through my cheap $20 paper shredder, watching it turn into meaningless confetti. Later that evening, an unknown number slipped through my phone's block list. It was Mark. He was drunk. The voicemail he left was a pathetic, slurring monologue, oscillating between violent rage and crying manipulation. He told me I was nothing without him. He told me the money would ruin me. He begged me to come back to the penthouse, promising things would be different, that we could share our lives again. I listened to the message once, staring out the window at the flickering streetlights of my run-down neighborhood. His words, which once would have shattered my heart and sent me spiraling into apologies, now meant absolutely nothing. The spell was broken. I deleted the voicemail, permanently erasing his voice from my life, and finally went to sleep with a peaceful, untroubled mind.
The night of the Autumn Masters auction arrived. I took a taxi to the opulent venue, wearing a simple, elegant navy dress I had bought off the rack. I didn't want to stand out. I didn't want to wear millions of dollars on my wrist or neck. I just wanted to bear witness to the end of this journey. Mr. Harrison met me at the discreet side entrance, beaming with nervous excitement.
He escorted me up a carpeted staircase to a private, glass-enclosed viewing box overlooking the massive auction floor. "Are you ready, Clara?" he asked, pouring me a glass of sparkling water. "The room is packed. We have phone bidders registered from Tokyo, London, and Dubai. The anticipation is staggering."
"I'm ready," I said, looking down at the sea of wealthy collectors, art dealers, and socialites taking their seats below. I felt completely detached from the wealth in the room. Sitting in that dark, quiet box, I reflected on the $5 painting. It had hung in a dusty closet, unseen and unappreciated, much like my own spirit during my marriage.
We had both been neglected, deemed unworthy of the light. But just because someone else fails to see your value doesn't mean your value decreases. The painting was about to be recognized for its true worth, and in a way, so was I. The money would change my circumstances, but the journey had already changed my soul.
I took a sip of water as the auctioneer, a distinguished man with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium and tapped his microphone. The room fell into a reverent hush. It was time.
"Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice echoing through the grand hall, "we now come to lot 42, the piece you have all been waiting for, a truly miraculous rediscovery." Two handlers wearing white cotton gloves wheeled a large easel onto the stage. The canvas was draped in a black velvet cloth. With a synchronized, dramatic flourish, they pulled the cloth away. A collective gasp swept through the room. Even under the bright, clinical gallery lights, the painting looked alive. The swirling, complex hues of the abstract sunset burned with a fiery intensity. It was breathtaking. An undocumented original by VV, fully authenticated, presented by an anonymous private collector, the auctioneer declared. "We will open the bidding at $12 million.
"Do I have 12 million? 12 million. A man in the front row raised his paddle instantly. "I have 12. Do I have 13? 13 million on the phones," a clerk shouted from a bank of desks to the right. 14? Another paddle flew up. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. 15, 17, 20 million.
The wealthy elite were fighting tooth and nail over the very thing my ex-husband had called trash. They were throwing fortunes at the canvas that had kept me company in my darkest, loneliest moments. 22 million, the auctioneer called out, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. 23 to the gentleman in the back. Do I have 24?
I gripped the edge of the glass partition, watching the frenzy unfold below. The bidding war was fierce, relentless, and entirely beyond anything I could have ever imagined.
The bidding war for my flea market painting stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 10 minutes of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The numbers being tossed across the room had long since lost their meaning, blurring into a surreal symphony of wealth. 27 million on the phones, the auctioneer announced, his voice practically vibrating with excitement. The man in the front row, who had been aggressively bidding since the beginning, wiped his mouth with a silk handkerchief and raised his paddle one last time. $28 million, the auctioneer roared. "I have $28 million in the room. Are we all done at 28? A heavy, breathless silence descended upon the grand hall. Even the clerks on the phones stopped talking. I held my breath, gripping the glass partition of my private box so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Going once at $28 million, the auctioneer said slowly, letting the suspense hang in the air. "Going twice?" He raised his wooden gavel high above the podium. Bang. "Sold for $28 million to the gentleman in the front row." The room erupted into thunderous applause, a standing ovation for the lost masterpiece. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were tears of profound, overwhelming liberation. Just a few months ago, a gavel had banged in a cold courtroom, rendering me discarded and worthless. Tonight, another gavel had banged, validating my worth and rewriting my future forever. I closed my eyes, letting the applause wash over me, knowing that my life would never be the same. The following days were a whirlwind of paperwork, financial advisors, and private banking meetings arranged by Mr. Harrison. After the auction house took their commission and the necessary taxes were set aside, I was left with an astonishing, life-altering fortune securely sitting in my name. When everything was finalized, I walked out of the massive bank building in the heart of the financial district. The city air felt different on my skin. It didn't feel heavy with judgment or anxiety anymore. It felt crisp, full of endless possibilities. I was a blank slate. I took a deep breath and immediately called Sarah, my former public assistance lawyer. I insisted she meet me for lunch at the most expensive restaurant in the city. When she arrived, looking slightly overwhelmed by the white tablecloths and crystal glosses, I slid a certified check across the table to her. It was enough to pay off her massive law school loans and keep her modest practice running comfortably for years. "Clara, I can't accept this," she stammered, her eyes wide behind her glasses. "It's too much. You were the only person who treated me like a human being when I felt like garbage," I told her, my voice steady and resolute. "You protected me when I couldn't protect myself. Please, let me do this. Consider it a retainer for a lifetime of friendship." Tears welled in her eyes as she carefully folded the check. That single moment of paying kindness forward felt more valuable to me than the entire $28 million sitting in the bank. I was finally in a position to build, rather than just survive. I didn't buy a penthouse. I had no desire to return to the cold, sterile luxury that had suffocated my spirit for 5 years. Instead, I spent months searching for the perfect home, eventually finding a charming, slightly overgrown Victorian house on the quiet outskirts of the city. It needed work, but it had character. It had creaky hardwood floors, large bay windows that let in pools of golden sunlight, and a sprawling backyard filled with wild rose bushes and ancient oak trees. It was the exact opposite of Mark's minimalist, monochrome aesthetic. I hired a team to restore the plumbing and the roof, but I did the painting myself. I painted the living room a warm, inviting terracotta, the kitchen a cheerful yellow, and my bedroom a deep, restful blue. I filled the house with comfortable, plush furniture that you could actually sink into, and I scoured antique shops for unique, mismatched pieces that told a story. My home became a sanctuary of color and warmth. There were no rules about where I could place a coffee mug, and no one to scoff at my dog-eared paperback books stacked on the floor. Every corner of the house reflected my soul, completely unfiltered and unjudged. I finally had a space that nurtured me, a place where the clutter was just evidence of a life being thoroughly and happily lived. With my home established, I realized I needed a purpose. The money provided security, but it didn't provide meaning. I thought back to my $5 painting, how it had sat in obscurity, entirely unappreciated, simply because it wasn't in the right frame or hanging on the right wall. I knew there were countless artists and countless people experiencing that exact same neglect. I purchased an abandoned warehouse in the downtown arts district and spent the next year transforming it into a community center and gallery. I named it The Canvas.
It was a place entirely dedicated to giving struggling, unknown artists a platform. We offered free studio space, provided art supplies to underprivileged children, and hosted monthly exhibitions where local talents could showcase their work without the elitist gatekeeping of high-end galleries. Walking through the vibrant, paint-splattered halls of the canvas gave me a joy I had never known.
I surrounded myself with passionate, messy, creative people who valued expression over perfection. I wasn't just a discarded wife anymore. I was a patron, a mentor, and a friend. I had taken the profound pain of my past and the miraculous luck of my present, and I had woven them together to build a safety net for others. My life had become a beautiful, chaotic masterpiece of its own.
It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 years after the divorce was finalized. We were setting up a new exhibition at the Canvas, featuring watercolor portraits by local high school students. I was on a stepladder, adjusting a spotlight, when I heard a familiar voice at the gallery entrance. "Excuse me, I'm looking for the owner." My heart did a strange, hollow thump.
I carefully climbed down the ladder and turned around. Standing near the reception desk, dripping wet from the rain, was Mark. He looked drastically different. The sharp, arrogant edge that used to define his posture was gone. His tailored suit looked a little loose, and the gray in his hair was no longer distinguished, just tired. He looked smaller somehow. When his eyes found me, he froze.
He looked around the bustling, vibrant gallery, taking in the massive space, the colorful artwork, and the undeniable success of the foundation. Then he looked back at me, wearing paint-stained overalls and a genuinely happy smile. "Clara," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain drumming against the skylights. I didn't feel the panic I expected. I didn't feel the urge to run or hide. I just felt a quiet, profound calm. "Hello, Mark," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "What brings you here?" He walked toward me slowly, as if approaching a stranger he was afraid of startling. He looked around the gallery once more, shaking his head in disbelief. "I read about this place in a magazine," he admitted, his voice raspy. "I saw your name listed as the founder. I had to see it for myself." "Well, you've seen it," I said politely, offering no further invitation. Mark looked down at his expensive shoes. "Things haven't been good, Clara. My firm underwent a massive restructuring. I was let go. I've had to sell the penthouse. It turns out that lifestyle, it's incredibly fragile when you don't have anyone to share it with." He looked up, his eyes pleading for a sympathy I no longer possessed.
He was waiting for me to gloat, to throw my $28 million in his face, or to welcome him back with open arms to fix his broken life. "I'm sorry to hear you're struggling, Mark," I said, my tone gentle but entirely detached. "But I'm afraid I don't have the capacity to help you. We live very different lives now." "You were right," he whispered, a tear finally escaping his eye. "I was a fool. I threw away everything that actually mattered. I threw you away." "Yes, you did," I agreed calmly, "and I'm grateful every day that you did, because if you hadn't, I would never have found this." I gestured to the gallery, and implicitly to myself. "Goodbye, Mark." He stood there for a long moment, the devastating reality of my indifference finally sinking in. He realized that my forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It simply meant I no longer carried the burden of his existence. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and turned around. I watched him walk out the glass doors and disappear into the pouring rain. As the door clicked shut behind him, I waited for the emotional fallout. I waited for the sadness, the anger, or the regret to wash over me, but there was nothing. Only a profound, breathless lightness. For years, Mark had been a heavy, suffocating shadow over my life. Even after the divorce, the memory of his cruel words and his arrogant dismissal had lived quietly in the back of my mind. But seeing him now, broken, humbled, and completely powerless over my emotions, shattered the final remnants of that shadow. I walked back to the stepladder and finished adjusting the spotlight on a student's painting. I wasn't defined by the man who had discarded me, nor was I entirely defined by the millions in my bank account. I was defined by the piece I had built from the rubble. The ghost of my past had finally been put to rest. That evening, the canvas hosted its largest opening night yet. The gallery was packed with people from all walks of life: wealthy donors, struggling artists, families from the neighborhood, and friends I had made over the last 2 years. The air was thick with laughter, clinking glasses, and the passionate hum of artistic discussion. Sarah was there, laughing near the refreshment table, looking relaxed and happy. Even Mr. Harrison had made the trip from the auction house, admiring the raw, unpolished talent hanging on the walls. I stood near the back of the room, taking it all in. A young girl, no older than 16, ran up to me with tears streaming down her face. "Miss Clara," she cried, hugging me tightly. "Someone just bought my painting! They actually bought it! They said it spoke to them!" I hugged her back, feeling the sting of happy tears in my own eyes. "I knew they would," I told her softly. "Never let anyone tell you your work isn't valuable. It just takes the right eyes to see it." Watching her run back to her proud parents, I realized the true power of the money I had stumbled upon. It wasn't about buying yachts or designer clothes. It was about creating a space where other people could be seen, valued, and cherished. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing my overgrown garden in a brilliant golden light. I sat on my back porch, wrapped in my grandmother's worn quilt, the same quilt I had carefully packed into a cardboard box on the worst day of my life. I held a mismatched, chipped coffee mug, feeling the warmth of the ceramic seep into my hands. Everything had come full circle. I looked at the blooming rose bushes and the tall oak trees swaying in the gentle breeze. My life was simple, quiet, and deeply fulfilling. I thought about the word junk. Mark had used it as a weapon, a word designed to belittle me and the things I loved. He wanted a life of pristine perfection, untouched by the messy, emotional reality of human existence. But I had learned that the most beautiful things in life are often found in the clutter. They are found in the dusty corners, the forgotten flea markets, and the quiet, unpolished moments. True value isn't dictated by an arrogant man in a tailored suit. It is inherent, waiting patiently beneath the surface to be discovered and appreciated. The universe had taken my darkest moment of rejection and handed me a miracle, simply because I had refused to leave my junk behind. I walked back inside my colorful, chaotic house. In the center of my living room, hanging proudly above the fireplace, was a framed, high-quality replica of my $5 painting. The original VV was hanging in a high-security museum across the country, loaned out by the private collector who had purchased it. But the replica was mine. I stood before it, tracing the swirling, abstract sunset with my eyes. I remembered the day I bought it, the day I cleaned the dust from the signature, and the heart-stopping moment the auction gavel fell. It was the catalyst that had burned my old life to the ground and provided the seeds for my new one. I am no longer Clara, the discarded wife. I am Clara, the founder, the patron, and the survivor. Life is rarely a pristine, minimalist canvas. It is messy, thick with overlapping colors, unexpected shadows, and chaotic brushstrokes. Sometimes the colors clash. Sometimes it looks like a disaster. But if you step back, if you wait for the paint to dry, you realize that every single stroke was necessary to create the final image. My journey had been painful, terrifying, and deeply unfair. But looking at the life I had built, surrounded by warmth, purpose, and unyielding peace, I knew one thing for certain: my life was finally a masterpiece.